I planned the Scotch bonnets. I planned the specific rhythm of the hair braiding. I even planned how to iron my navy blouse on a guest house floor. But I didn't plan the slap that would make me a national villain, and I certainly didn't plan falling in love with a man who controls the city's underworld. Before we reveal the truth behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this video. Comment "Justice" below and turn on post notifications so you never miss a chapter of this story. 6 months ago, Ijeoma Rebecca was just a shadow in a luxury penthouse, an invisible housekeeper whose only job was to stay quiet. Today, she stands in a Seoul courtroom, facing the most powerful socialite in the country and a media storm that calls her a gold-digging predator. In this explosive second part of the "Don't Touch Her Again" saga, the world sees a calculated strategist, but the woman on the stand sees something else. An aged mother who was being silenced in her own home, and a mafia boss who finally learned that loyalty isn't bought, it's earned. From the violent confrontation that left a billionaire's fiancé on the marble floor to the high-stakes pressure of a national trial, witness the moment a simple caregiver dismantles an empire of lies with nothing more than her strong hands and the memory of her grandmother's kitchen. This isn't just a romance, it's a trial of identity. And in a world of high-contrast power, Ijeoma is about to prove that her truth is the only weapon that can't be broken. Walk me through how that's not a strategy. The voice of the defense attorney, sharp and clinical as a surgeon's scalpel, cut through the heavy silence of the Seoul Central District Court. He stood barely 6 feet from the witness stand, his expensive suit tailored to perfection, representing a world that viewed Ijeoma Rebecca as nothing more than a glitch in a very expensive machine. He wasn't asking about the slap anymore. He wasn't asking about the day the marble floor of the penthouse was stained with the fallout of a family's secrets. He was asking how a woman with one suitcase and a work visa managed to become the central heartbeat of the Lee Empire in a matter of months. Ijeoma sat in the witness chair, her spine a straight line of iron. She wore her navy blouse, the same one she had ironed on the floor of a cramped guest house when she first arrived in Seoul. Lee Seo-jun had offered to buy her a wardrobe that could rival a queen's for this trial, but she had refused. She wanted the court to see the woman who had walked into that den of lions, not a version of herself dressed in the enemy's silk. Her hands rested in her lap, the skin dark against the navy fabric, the same hands that had ground peppers for jollof rice, the same hands that had meticulously braided Madame Choi's thinning hair, and the same hands that had finally struck the blow that shattered a socialite's mask of perfection. A maid who happens to find the boss's mother in distress. A maid who happens to cook the exact childhood meals he had forgotten. A maid who happens to be in the room when a legal document goes missing. The attorney continued, his pace quickening. To the public, it looks like a fairy tale. But to this court, it looks like a 3-year-long con executed in 80 days. You didn't just attack Shin Hae-ryung to protect an old woman, did you, Miss Rebecca? You attacked her to remove the only obstacle between you and the Lee fortune. Ijeoma looked past him. In the front row, Lee Seo-jun sat beside his mother's wheelchair. He was stripped of his mafia armor, wearing a simple dark coat, his eyes locked on Ijeoma with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. Beside him, Madame Choi reached back, her fingers finding the hem of Ijeoma's spare shawl, a silent anchor. Ijeoma turned back to the attorney. She didn't flinch. She didn't look like a woman caught in a lie. She looked like a woman who had finally stopped being invisible. "The only strategy I brought to that house," she said, her voice low and resonant, "was the one my grandmother taught me. You don't use your hands to take what isn't yours. You use them to hold up the people who are falling. If that is a crime in this city, then I am guilty." The morning after the slap, the 43rd floor penthouse felt different. The air, which had for months been heavy with the suffocating, expensive scent of Shin Hae-ryung's jasmine perfume, was finally beginning to clear. It was a new kind of silence, not the cold, pressurized quiet of a fortress, but the hollow, echoing stillness of a house that had just survived a storm. Ijeoma stood in the center of the vast living room, her hands tucked into the pockets of her apron. On the white marble floor, a single broken shard from Madame Choi's glasses caught the morning sun, glinting like a diamond. She knelt to pick it up, her fingers grazing the spot where Hae Ryung had fallen just hours before. The chaos was gone, the shouting had ceased, and the most powerful socialite in Seoul had been escorted out by men who didn't care about her designer heels or her family's stock prices. She walked toward the kitchen, the soft soles of her shoes squeaking against the polished stone. In the master suite, she knew Lee Seo-jun was awake. She had heard the low, rhythmic hum of his voice on the phone since 5 a.m., likely managing the legal fallout or the whispers in the underworld about why his engagement had ended in a scandal. But here, in the common space, the absence of Hae Ryung's sharp voice and constant demands felt like a physical relief. Ijeoma opened the heavy refrigerator, her eyes landing on the vibrant red Scotch bonnets she had bought in secret. For the first time since she arrived with her single suitcase, she didn't feel like a shadow blending into the walls. She felt like a sentry. She began to prepare a tray, not for a boss, but for the woman in the wheelchair who was currently the only heart beating in this glass museum. As she moved, a shadow darkened the doorway. Ijeoma didn't startle. She recognized the heavy, deliberate step. Lee Seo-jun stood there, his silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, looking less like a mafia boss and more like a man who had spent the night staring at the ceiling. He didn't look at the stove or the tray. His eyes settled on Ijeoma's right hand, the hand that had struck the blow. "The jasmine is gone," he said, his voice gravelly and quiet. It wasn't a question. "It was never a scent that belonged here, sir," Ijeoma replied, her voice steady. He took a step into the kitchen, a space he usually treated as a utility room he had no business entering. He looked at the peppers, the steam rising from the kettle, and then back at the woman who had risked everything to protect a mother he hadn't known how to save himself. The silence stretched, but for the first time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the sound of a legacy shifting. The penthouse was too quiet without the sharp click of Hae Ryung's heels, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. In the center of the sun-drenched sunroom, Ijeoma stood behind Madame Choi's wheelchair, her fingers moving with the rhythmic precision of a weaver. She was partitioning the professor's silver hair into 3 neat sections, the texture a familiar map under her fingertips. In this house of cold marble and high-stakes secrets, this was the only ritual that didn't require a contract. "You're thinking too much, Ijeoma," Madame Choi said, her voice gravelly but sharp, her eyes fixed on the Seoul skyline. "I can feel the tension in your knuckles. A braid should be a conversation, not a battle." Ijeoma softened her grip, smoothing a stray strand with a touch of shea butter. "I'm just wondering how long the silence lasts before the storm returns. Shin Hae Ryung isn't a woman who stays down for long." Madame Choi chuckled, a dry sound that shook her frail shoulders. "Hae Ryung is a creature of optics. She is currently calculating the statistical significance of her outrage. But my son, he is calculating something else entirely." She paused as Ijeoma crossed a section of hair over the center. "Have you noticed? Seo-jun has forgotten how to sit. He paces the corridors like a predator that's realized the bars of his cage are made of his own making." Ijeoma's hands faltered for a fraction of a second. She remembered the way Seo-jun had looked at her after the slap, not with the fury of a mafia boss whose pride had been dented, but with the bewildered curiosity of a man seeing color for the first time. "He's a busy man, madam. He has an empire to run." "He has a chair to sit in, yet he stands in the doorway of the kitchen just to watch you boil water," the professor countered, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "He is terrified, Ijeoma. In our world, everything is a transaction. You are the first person to walk into this house and offer a radical care that didn't come with a bill. It has ruined his equilibrium. He doesn't know where to put his hands when they aren't holding a weapon or a pen." Ijeoma pulled the braid tight, securing it with a small, clear band. She stepped around the chair to face the older woman, whose cornrows were now neat and dignified, a crown of silver against her weathered skin. The bruises from the encounter were fading, but the bond between them had only deepened. "Let him pace," Ijeoma whispered, kneeling so they were eye to eye. Sometimes a man needs to realize the floor is solid before he dares to sit down. Madame Choi reached out, her thin, scholarly fingers catching Ijeoma's hand, the one that had struck the blow for her freedom. "Just remember, my dear, these hands were made for more than just cleaning up other people's messes. They were made to hold what is yours." The heavy mahogany doors of the Lee estate usually acted as a barrier between two worlds. But that evening, the air felt different. Ijeoma was in the kitchen, the steam from a pot of jollof rice rising like a spicy, defiant cloud against the sterile minimalism of the penthouse. She was still wearing the navy blouse, the fabric now carrying the faint scent of thyme and Scotch bonnets, a scent that didn't belong in a Mafia stronghold, yet was the only thing making it feel like a home. The soft thud of footsteps on the marble made her turn, expecting the sharp, rhythmic click of Lee Seo-jun's Italian leather shoes. Instead, there was a heavy, human silence. Seo-jun stood in the doorway, but the man who controlled the city's underworld was nowhere to be found. He wasn't wearing the charcoal suit that acted as his armor, nor the silk tie that always seemed to choke the warmth out of his expressions. He was in a simple, slightly faded gray t-shirt and dark cotton trousers. Without the padding of his blazer, he looked leaner, more approachable, and unexpectedly vulnerable. The harsh overhead lighting caught the exhaustion in his eyes, stripping away the CEO and leaving only the man. "The lawyers are calling it a PR nightmare," he said, his voice dropping the clinical edge it usually held during board meetings. He walked toward the kitchen island, not with the stride of a predator, but with the hesitation of a guest. "They say I should distance myself, that a domestic worker's assault on a conglomerate heiress is a fire that will consume the company." Ijeoma didn't lower the wooden spoon. "And what does the man in the gray shirt say?" Seo-jun reached out, his fingers brushing the cool granite of the counter near her hand. He didn't look at the pot, he looked at her. "The man in the gray shirt is tired of strategies. He's tired of people who use my mother as a chess piece." He paused, a ghost of a smile appearing, the kind that didn't make it into the tabloids. "And he's wondering if the woman who threw the world's most famous slap is free this Wednesday." Ijeoma paused, the steam swirling between them. "Wednesday isn't a day for the Lee family, Seo-jun. Wednesday is for chores." "Not this time," he countered softly. "No drivers, no security detail, no mahogany tables between us. Just a Wednesday. A date, Ijeoma. Somewhere where no one knows my title and everyone can see your face." For the first time since the slap, the high-pressure air of the penthouse seemed to clear. Ijeoma looked at his outstretched hand, the hand of a man who had finally learned how to sit and listen. She realized then that while Hae Ryung was busy planning a war, Seo-jun was busy planning a beginning. "I'll bring the peppers," she said quietly, "and I'll bring the person who's ready to hear the truth," he replied. The air at the Namdaemun market smelled of dried anchovies and cold rain, a sharp contrast to the sterile, pressurized scent of the Lee penthouse. Ijeoma walked through the narrow aisles, her fingers tracing the rough texture of her woven shopping bag. In the penthouse, her hands had power. They had shielded a professor and struck a socialite. But here, under the flickering fluorescent lights of the vegetable stalls, those same hands seemed to fade into the gray morning mist. She stopped at a stall where crates of red peppers sat like piles of rubies. She needed the sharp, stinging heat of Scotch bonnets to make the soup Madame Choi had asked for, a taste of home to anchor the older woman during the storm of the trial. "Excuse me," Ijeoma said, her voice steady and polite. The vendor, a woman with deep-set wrinkles and a visor pulled low, didn't look up. She continued snapping the stems off green onions, her movements rhythmic and dismissive. Two other women pushed past Ijeoma, their elbows sharp as they reached for the best bundles. They spoke rapidly in Korean, their voices rising over the din of the market. The vendor immediately wiped her hands on her apron, smiling and nodding as she weighed their produce, her eyes never once drifting toward the tall woman in the navy blouse standing directly in front of her. Ijeoma waited. She knew this silence. It wasn't the silence of the courtroom, which was heavy with judgment. This was the silence of the void. It was the quiet realization that you could slap a person, but you could not slap a system. You could defy a villain, but you could not force a world to acknowledge you exist if it had already decided you were part of the scenery. "I'd like these peppers, please," Ijeoma tried again, shifting her weight. The vendor reached right past Ijeoma's outstretched hand to take a bill from a businessman behind her. It was as if Ijeoma were made of glass, a ghost haunted by the very peppers she was trying to buy. The gold digger headlines had turned her into a national character, a headline to be debated, yet in the physical world, she remained a shadow. The weight of the isolation pressed against her chest. In the penthouse, she was a threat. In the newspapers, she was a predator. But here, in the heart of the city she had bled for, she was simply nothing. She looked down at her strong hands, now trembling slightly at her sides. She realized then that the trial wouldn't just be about a slap or a fiancé's lies. It would be about whether she could ever truly step out of the gray dress of a maid and into the light of a woman who was seen. Turning away from the stall, empty-handed, she realized that while she had won the first battle in the penthouse, the war for her humanity was only just beginning. The grocery bag was heavy, a crinkled plastic weight that felt foreign in Lee Seo-jun's hands. It wasn't the weight of a weapon or a briefcase full of ledgers. It was the sharp, spicy scent of a dozen Scotch bonnets. He walked into the penthouse kitchen, the marble floors cool beneath his leather shoes, and placed the bag on the counter with a quiet thud. Ijeoma was there, her back to him, her hands moving in a rhythmic dance as she prepped the evening meal. She didn't turn around. In this house, silence had always been a tool of intimidation, but lately, between the two of them, it had become a bridge. Seo-jun didn't bark an order or demand her attention. Instead, he pulled out a stool, the one he usually ignored in favor of his mahogany desk, and sat. He watched the way her shoulders dropped an inch, a subtle sign that she knew he was there and, more importantly, that she knew he wasn't going anywhere. "The market was loud," he said, his voice low, vibrating in the high-ceilinged room. "And the woman at the stall, she tried to look past me, just like you said." Ijeoma paused, her knife hovering over a red bell pepper. She turned then, her eyes searching his. She saw the CEO of a multi-billion won empire, a man whose name made rivals tremble, sitting on a kitchen stool with a bag of cheap groceries. It was a visual contradiction that shouldn't have worked, yet it was the most honest he had ever looked. He wasn't trying to fix the trial in that moment. He wasn't trying to buy her a better lawyer or bribe a judge. He was just sitting in the heat of her world. "You bought them yourself," she whispered, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I did," he replied, sliding the bag toward her. "I realized that I've spent my whole life making people move for me. I never learned how to just stay." He reached out, his fingers brushing the plastic of the bag before retreating. "Madam Choi is sleeping. She asked if you'd braid her hair tomorrow. She says your hands have a way of making her forget the wheelchair exists." Ijeoma reached for the Scotch bonnets, the vibrant orange and red skins glowing under the kitchen's golden pendant lights. For a moment, the looming threat of Shin Hae-ryung's lawsuit and the gold digger headlines felt like they belonged to a different life. Here, in the heart of the home, the air smelled of spice and unspoken promises. Seo-jun didn't get up to take a call or check his watch. He stayed on the stool, watching her work, finally understanding that his protection wasn't in his power, but in his presence. He wasn't just her boss anymore. He was a man learning that the strongest thing he could do for the woman he loved was simply to sit with her. The lion's den had always been a place of quiet, clinical precision. But by Monday morning, the silence was replaced by the deafening roar of a digital execution. It started with a single grainy image splashed across a tabloid header. Lee Seo-jun, the untouchable titan of the Seoul underworld, sitting on a low stool in a dimly lit kitchen, while Ijeoma Rebecca stood over him, her hand resting naturally, intimately on his shoulder. Shin Hae-ryung had not used a gun to retaliate. She had used a lens. By noon, 100 more photos flooded the internet. Ijeoma helping Madam Choi into her wheelchair, Ijeoma buying specific peppers at the market, Ijeoma and Seo-jun sharing a quiet look in the back of a black sedan. Under Hae-ryung's orchestration, the narrative of radical care was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into a horror story of the corporate groomer. The headlines were surgical. They didn't call Ijeoma a maid, they called her a social architect. They didn't describe her care for Madam Choi as kindness, they labeled it isolation tactics. The media suggested that Ijeoma had spent months studying the weaknesses of the Lee family, using her strong hands not to heal, but to weave a web around a grieving son and a vulnerable elderly professor. The very cultural touches that made Ijeoma feel at home, the jollof rice, the braiding of hair, were recast as exotic lures used to distract the CEO while she infiltrated the inner sanctum of his empire. Inside the penthouse, the air turned cold again. Seo-jun stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection ghost-like against the gray skyline. In his hand, he gripped a tablet showing a side-by-side comparison of Hae-ryung's tearful face and Ijeoma's defiant stance from the day of the slap. The public had already chosen their victim. "They are calling it a long con, Ijeoma," Seo-jun said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He didn't turn around, but his knuckles were white. "They say you didn't hit her to protect my mother. They say you hit her to remove the only person who saw through your strategy." Ijeoma stood at the kitchen island, the scent of the Scotch bonnets she had just chopped still clinging to her skin. For the first time since the slap, she felt the weight of her own invisibility returning, but this time it was different. Before, the world didn't see her because she was the help. Now, the world refused to see her because they had replaced her with a monster of their own making. "I was hired to protect your mother's body," Ijeoma said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. "I didn't realize I'd have to protect my own soul from a camera lens." The corporate trap had snapped shut. Outside, the reporters were gathering like vultures at the gates, waiting for the maid who stole a legacy to show her face. Hae-ryung had succeeded in turning Ijeoma's greatest strength, her heart, into the very evidence used to condemn her. The mirror in the hotel room was too large, too clear, and far too expensive, but Ijeoma avoided looking at it. Instead, she knelt on the hardwood floor, the same way she had done the night she first arrived in Seoul. Spread out before her was the navy blouse, the one garment that had survived the transition from a cramped guest house to a mafia's penthouse. It was a simple piece of fabric, but to her, it was a suit of armor that hadn't been bought with Lee Seo-jun's blood money or tailored by his high-priced stylists. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of 3 men in charcoal suits, carrying digital tablets and binders full of narrative strategies. They were the best crisis management team money could buy, sent by Seo-jun to sculpt her image before she stepped into the witness box. "Miss Rebecca," the lead consultant began, his voice smooth and clinical. "We've curated a wardrobe that projects vulnerability, soft pastels, perhaps a traditional knit. We need the public to see a victim, not a woman who slaps socialites. We've also drafted a statement that softens your background, less housekeeper, more family companion." Ijeoma didn't look up. She pressed the heavy iron onto the collar of her blouse, the steam rising in a warm, familiar cloud that smelled of starch and resilience. "I am not a victim," she said, her voice low but vibrating with a frequency that silenced the room. "And I am not a companion. I am the woman who saw a mother bleeding on a marble floor while the world looked the other way. If I change my clothes to please the cameras, I am telling the court that the woman who saved Madame Choi is someone to be ashamed of. The media will tear you apart in that blouse, the consultant warned, his frustration peaking. They want a gold digger. If you look like a maid, you give them exactly what they want. Ijeoma finally stood, draped the navy fabric over her arm, and looked him in the eye. Let them look. They've spent months trying to rewrite my life into a scheme, but they forget one thing. I didn't plan the love, and I didn't plan the fight. I just showed up. She walked past the million-dollar strategists and their tablets, her footsteps firm. She didn't need a script written by men who lived in glass towers. She needed the weight of that ironed collar against her neck to remind her of where she came from. As she reached the door, she saw Seo Jun standing in the hallway, his silhouette dark against the city lights. He looked at the simple blouse, then at her face, and for the first time, he didn't try to manage the situation. He simply stepped aside, giving her the path. She wasn't going to court as a mafia boss's girlfriend. She was going as Ijeoma Rebecca, the woman with the strong hands, ready to let the truth do the rest of the work. The defense attorney's shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, a predatory rhythm that filled the silence of the courtroom. He leaned over the railing, his shadow falling across Ijeoma's navy blouse. A woman who plans her meals, plans her routes to the market, and plans her employer's schedule down to the minute. Expect us to believe that slap wasn't part of a larger plan to secure your future. Ijeoma didn't look at the cameras or the murmuring gallery. She looked at her hands. They were resting in her lap, dark and steady against the fabric she had ironed herself. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, resonant bell. In my village in Uganda, my grandmother taught me that hands are the first story a person tells, she began, ignoring the lawyer's scoff. She had hands that could shell 1,000 kernels of corn without breaking a nail, but they were the same hands that held me when the fever came. She taught me that a plan is what you do for yourself, but a response is what you do for the people who cannot protect themselves. She turned her head slightly, her gaze catching Madame Choi in the front row. The elderly woman sat with a professor's poise, her silver hair captured in the neat braids Ijeoma had finished only hours ago. I didn't plan to hit Shin Hae-ryung, Ijeoma continued, her voice tightening with the memory of that afternoon in the penthouse. I didn't plan to risk my visa, my livelihood, or my safety. But when I saw a woman, a guest, a fiancée, raise her hand to a mother who was already trapped in a body that wouldn't move, I didn't need a strategy. I needed a response. She looked directly at the judge now, her eyes unflinching. If you see a fire and you throw water on it, is that a long con to become a hero? No. It is simply because you cannot stand the smell of something precious burning. My grandmother used to say that a heart with a plan is cold, but a heart with a response is alive. I didn't choose to fall in love with Lee Seo-jun because of his bank account. I chose to stay because he was the first person in this city who looked at my strong hands and didn't see a tool. He saw a woman. The attorney tried to interrupt, to pivot back to his gold digger narrative, but the air in the room had shifted. The calculated arithmetic of the prosecution was melting under the heat of a truth that wasn't rehearsed. Ijeoma wasn't a maid playing a part. She was a woman claiming her space, proving that while she had ironed her blouse on a floor, her spirit had never been walked on. In that moment, the courtroom didn't see a strategist. They saw a protector. The steam from the pot rose in a fragrant cloud, carrying the sharp, honest heat of Scotch bonnets and the deep, savory promise of parboiled rice. It was Tuesday in the penthouse, but the air no longer felt pressurized like a lion's den. The cold marble seemed to have thawed, warmed by the rhythmic thumping of a wooden spoon against the side of a heavy pot. Ijeoma stood at the stove, her movements steady and sure. She wasn't wearing the maid's uniform anymore. She wore a soft linen dress that moved with her, though her hands, those strong, capable hands, remained the same. The courtroom was a week behind them now. The verdict had been read in a room that felt too small for the truth it finally held. Shin Hae-ryung's empire of social standing and calculated cruelty had collapsed under the weight of Professor Yoonji's testimony and the undeniable evidence of a daughter-in-law who valued a legacy more than the life that built it. The gold digger headlines had been replaced by a quiet, collective realization that the most dangerous person in the room wasn't the woman with the suitcase, but the one with the hidden motive. A shadow fell across the kitchen doorway. Lee Seo-jun didn't enter with the heavy tread of a mafia boss or the sharp edge of a CEO. He walked in like a man coming home. He had traded his tailored suits for a simple dark sweater, his eyes losing that constant, calculating arithmetic of survival. He watched Ijeoma for a moment, the way she tasted the sauce, the way she checked the tenderness of the meat. He had learned that love wasn't found in grand contracts or protected borders. It was found in the silence of a woman who knew exactly how he liked his coffee and exactly why his mother needed the window open. "The professor is waiting," Seo-jun said softly, stepping closer. "She says if the jollof is late, she's going to start grading your performance." Ijeoma laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the kitchen. "Tell her the rice doesn't move for the law or the academy. It moves when it's ready." She picked up the large serving spoon, the one no one else was allowed to touch, and began to plate the food. As they sat at the table, Madame Choi Myung-hee looked at them through her new glasses, her posture as sharp as ever. There was no maid, no boss, and no victim. There was only a family. Ijeoma felt a flutter in her stomach, a secret rhythm that had nothing to do with the meal. She looked at Seo-jun and then at the sonogram tucked into the corner of a framed photo on the sideboard. A new legacy was beginning, one built on the courage to protect the vulnerable. On this Tuesday, the truth was finally enough. Ijeoma Rebecca arrived in Seoul with one suitcase and a pair of strong hands. She left this courtroom with a family, a legacy, and the realization that while the world may try to make you invisible, the truth has a voice that can fill every seat in the room. Love isn't a strategy, and care isn't a scheme. It's the only thing worth fighting for. If Ijeoma's courage inspired you today, subscribe to join our community. Like this video to help us tell more stories of resilience, share it with someone who needs to hear the truth, and comment your thoughts on the verdict below, and tell us where in the world you are watching from. Don't forget to turn on post notifications, stay dangerous, and stay loved.